Hi learners, welcome to the NPTEL course, Strategy and Technology, a Practical Primer. We are in week 1, the topic being Structural Strategic Analysis. In today's lecture, which is the third in the series, we will discuss the all-important topic of 5 forces model. The 5 forces model was first propounded by Professor Michael Porter as part of his theory of competitive strategy. This word competitive strategy keeps recurring in our series of lectures. Why is it so important? Why can't we just call it strategy? Why do we call it competitive strategy? Competition has been as involved with human civilization as the civilization itself has been. Whether we take it as the Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest or the more refined method of looking at human competition, that is self-actualization, the urge to excel over another has always been the driver of human progress. In the contemporary context, competition is to be viewed as something that will enable offering of better products and services to customers. From an individual perspective, when a student competes, the competition is not merely for getting higher grades. The competition is for acquiring more knowledge and becoming more useful to the society and the nation through the firms in which the student gets employed. Similarly, when a company wants to compete with another company and excel over another company, the real motive should be to offer better products and services to the customers. So that's where the perspective of competitive strategy must really ring a bell when we talk about strategy. The essence of formulating strategy is relating the company to the environment, including the industry in which it operates. We have seen in the previous lecture that there are factors outside the control of the company and factors that are internal to the company, and these have to be amalgamated in the development of strategy. Competition in an industry is rooted in the underlying economic structure and goes well beyond the behavior of current competitors. There are certain industries which offer enormous scope for companies to grow. The competitive level in those industries would be a bit less than the industries in which every company has to fight for its share, and in such industries where there is high level of rivalry. So the state of competition is germane not only to the company but also to the industry. Professor Michael Porter proposed that the state of competition in an industry depends on 5 basic competitive forces, which we will see as part of this lecture. The collective strength or the collective impact of these forces determines the ultimate profit potential in the industry. If the competitive forces are very vigorous, very volatile, and very intense, the profit potential would be muted. On the other hand, if the competitive forces can be easily handled by the respective companies, then the profit potential would be high. From a strategy perspective, profit potential cannot be measured through quarterly earnings, but it has to be measured through the long-term return in the invested capital. According to Professor Porter, not all industries have the same potential in terms of profit. There are different types of industries, as we have seen, and some of them are cyclical industries, some of them are stable industries, some of them are growth industries, some of them are emerging industries. The profit potential therefore varies. Depending also on the nature of incumbents in an industry, the profit potential could vary. So the collective intensity of the competitive forces and the company's unique strategy determines the profit potential of an industry. The 5 forces model is essentially this. Every firm in an industry faces 5 forces. These 5 forces pertain to the potential entrants to the industry, the buyers in the industry, buyers meaning the customers, the substitute products that would be available in the industry, and the suppliers who provide the components and materials to the firms. And together with all of these things, there would be rivalry among existing firms. As the firms jostle with each other for market share or for better profitability, there would be higher rivalry. and that would be accompanied by the forces entrants, buyers, substitutes, and suppliers would place on the industry structure and therefore on the company strategy. Now, these 5 forces do not occur in isolation. They occur in the overarching umbrella of economy, and later the industry, and finally the firm. Every player can be included in one or the above 5 constituencies. A firm can be a potential entrant, a firm can also be an incumbent, a firm can be a buyer, a firm can be a supplier, a firm can be provider of substitute products. A firm can contribute to and also be subject to rivalry in the industry. At times, a firm plays multiple roles simultaneously. Samsung, as an example, is a huge competitor to Apple. But at the same time, Samsung provides display units to Apple and other companies. Sony is a competitor to several cell phone manufacturers, but Sony's camera sensors and camera modules are part of several competing cellular phone models. Therefore, firms can take 2 different avatars, as we may call. One of end product manufacturer competing in the open marketplace, and the other of providing inputs to each other. So this is the overall framework of the 5 forces model. Now, when a firm looks at itself and the industry, it views the 5 forces in terms of certain threats and the threat of new entrants is always a pressure. Why do we call it threat for the incumbent firm? Because when new entrants come, they upset the industry equilibrium, and depending upon the resource capability of the new firm can come up with higher capacities. Depending upon the technological capability, the new firm can come up with better methods of manufacture and even better product designs. And depending upon the relationships it has got with customers and channels, it could also have a preferential position in those aspects. Therefore, every new entry into an industry constitutes a threat for the incumbent company. The second one is one of bargaining power. Why do buyers have bargaining power? Why do customers have bargaining power? Because ultimately, whatever the firm does in terms of its products and services is aimed at fulfilling the customer needs. If the products are perceived to be short of meeting those needs, customers have the discretion to buy or not buy. Similarly, when certain economic conditions prove to be overwhelming, the customers may not be able to buy the way they would have bought in the good times. Therefore, by default, they exert certain bargaining power. That is, the firm has to seek customer demand in such situations. We have bargaining power from suppliers. Why do suppliers have bargaining power? When suppliers have high capacity and their capacity is more than what the OEM can take, then they have little bargaining power. On the other hand, if suppliers have proprietary technologies, have capacities which are very exclusive, then they tend to exert high bargaining power, the original equipment manufacturers. Also, when the industry is undergoing a transformation and new components or new materials have to be introduced, the suppliers tend to have higher bargaining power. And what is the threat of substitute products or services? It is not that always the existing product only would be improved, or that new entrants would come in with the similar type of products. There could be a product which is different in configuration, and it could meet the demand through a different way of convergence or divergence of functionality, in which case the substitute products or services could be strong threats. So we have threats coming in for the watch industry through digital health companions, which are also timekeepers. Even the iPod had its threat from its own in-house iPhone. So the threat of substitute products or services is always there as long as technology continues to be developed on a progressive manner. So in this case, the firm envisages all of this occurring in the industry, and whatever happens in the industry is based on whatever would be happening in the environment. This theory of 5 forces is based on industrial economics. The structure, conduct, performance theories of industrial economics have inspired Professor Porter to look at industrial competition, business competition, and competitive strategy through these five forces lens. What is the importance of competition? As I said, competition is essential for elevating the level of service to the customers. It is also essential to elevate the quality of life of individuals. Only competition can bring the best out of providers of products or services. But when competition comes in, 4-5 things happen. The first is that industry emerges. When a company comes up with a product that has been pioneering, only that company becomes the industry. However, when others enter the field looking at the opportunity, we can call them the competitors. When this happens, a whole new industry emerges, and after a hesitant start, that industry starts earning fair profits. Once competitors understand how they could update their technology, how they could expand their capacities, how the customer needs can be met in diverse methodologies, that industry grows. There would be rising profitability. It improves long-term returns to the incumbents. As more competitors enter to benefit, however, there would also be the increase in competitive forces. I have referred to the phase of competitive turbulence that could come towards the end of the growth process of the industrial evolution. When the incumbents become strong and they are at balance with each other, the industry could be seen to have attained a state of maturity. The industry achieves a dynamic equilibrium. Each company would be varying its market share and its presence over a few percentage points. However, there would be competition, but the competition would be more stable, more predictable, mainly because no new disruptive technologies are emerging in the mature industry market. Then comes the industry plateaus. That is, the industry starts consolidating towards a downward bias. Stronger players will remain, but the weaker players will start exiting. Stronger players will be accumulating market share, while weaker players would be selling out or exiting. When that happens, the industry plateau and the start of the decline commences. And finally, when the technology starts getting updated in a big manner, and when new products, new substitutes start appearing on the horizon, industry declines. Strangely, during these phases of industry maturity, industry plateau and industry decline, one may even witness unanticipated competition. I have mentioned in an earlier lecture that when markets are stable, multinationals tend to enter those markets because for them the production or sale potential in the home markets would have been saturated, and they would constantly be looking at other emerging markets to enter. Typically, they would tend to have better technologies or better ways of marketing, and they would come in and try to take a slice of these maturing and declining markets. That in turn drives the level of rivalry and level of unviability for the incumbents further up, and therefore the profit potential of the industry further down. Industry as a whole becomes unattractive and unviable. Only those firms which have really deep pockets, or only those firms which feel that they would survive the downturn and they would wait on for others to exit and finally come into the act of reinventing the industry. That's the way the industrial evolution takes place, through the competitive forces. Positive competition can certainly restructure and improve a current industry, while negative competition can cause its decline. It is left to the individuals to be positive on how they compete. Positivity in competition means better technology, better manufacturing process, better business processes, better ways of serving the customer, and better aftermarket service, and so on. On the other hand, negative competition means knee-jerk reactions, knee-jerk actions in terms of price drops, unhealthy dumping of products, and trying to influence the customers with non-product, non-service oriented perceptions. These are all facets of negative competition. Positive competition is always something which would be helpful for the industry and the customers in general. So to conduct this structural analysis of industries, as I said, we have to look at the threat of entry, quantify that. we have to assess the intensity of rivalry among competitors, we have to gauge the pressure from substitute products, and we have to quantify the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. For this, we need models which capture these indices. How do we measure? We can always have surrogates. That is, if new competitors come, the number of new competitors could be one index of the threat of entry. On the other hand, the capacity with which new competitors are coming relative to the capacity that is already on ground could be another index of the threat of entry. The market share that has been nibbled away from the existing players could be another index of the threat of entry. Similarly, when we talk about intensity of rivalry among competitors, the fluctuations or the trends in the profitability on various parameters like return on sales, return on assets, return on investment could be indicative of the intensity of rivalry. Pressure from substitute products depends on the nature of the products. If they are within the general product group, it is reflected by the migration of market share. On the other hand, if they take away the functionality of the existing products and come up with the new functionalities, then emergence of adjacent markets and newer markets which also compress the market for the existing products is an index of the pressure from substitute products. The bargaining power of buyers is indexed by the pressure on the product prices. If the pricing pressure is such that the company is not able to recover its genuine escalations in material costs, in operating costs, and instead has to do with only lower price increases, that means that the buyers have got strong bargaining power. If the buyers keep on switching from one brand to another brand, or if the buyers take too long to make their decisions, or if all the trials of products do not become actual purchase decisions, then we can conclude that the bargaining power of buyers is very high. And how do we reckon the bargaining power of suppliers? The material and component cost as percentage of the cost of goods sold is one good indication. The volatility of supplies could be another indication. Just as the threat of entry was measured in terms of new component players, we can also look at bargaining power of suppliers by the exit of good suppliers and then the capacity shortfalls. We are aware of the semiconductor shortage because the capacity was not sufficient and capacity was diverted to more lucrative electronic goods and other related smart variable activities. Therefore, the automobile industry and a few other traditional industries suffered. So we can say that at that point of time, the suppliers had huge bargaining power because they had lucrative other markets and they were negotiating with the traditional markets to assert their pricing and other relationships. And each of these five forces gets accentuated or attenuated by the specific nature of the industry. Let's look at each of these forces. How does the threat of entry get amplified? How can we view the threat of entry? It is one of the more formidable competitive forces. When Hindustan Motors, Premier Automobiles, and Standard Motors were only the three companies in the Indian passenger car industry in the 1970s, entry of Maruti in 1980s became the most formidable competitive force. And for Maruti, after it consolidated, entry of other multinationals constituted the formidable competitive force. And this cycle of competition through entry goes on in any industry evolution. Whenever somebody wants to enter an industry, it is not always cakewalk. The new entrant has to face certain barriers, and every incumbent in an industry tries to erect those barriers. What are those 6 barriers? 1. Economies of scale and scope, especially in R&D, operations and marketing. Assuming that a company has already taken an enduring market share and a dominant market share, and the substantial part of the demand is met by high-scale facilities, and the diversity in customer needs is met by diversity in product range offered by the company. it can be seen that the economies of scale and scope are weighed in favor of the incumbent. Similarly, when the scale is high, R&D, operations and marketing tend to be more efficient. So any newcomer who cannot invest that amount of money will be at a disadvantage. In addition, because these economies of scale and scope have been built over the years, it would be well nigh impossible for a new entrant to immediately match that level of scale and scope. Therefore, the dominant incumbent would always pose barriers to entry to a new entrant. The other threat of entry is product differentiation. That is, if the existing products are well differentiated in the customer mind, that would be the key barrier to entry of a new entrant. Per contra, if the new entrant is able to come with more differentiated product, the new entrant would be able to scale the barrier to entry and become successful in the industry in terms of the entry. Capital requirements are one of the most important barriers to entry. Because the existing facilities, existing infrastructure and existing operations have been smoothly going on for a long time, the equipment and the operations would tend to be depreciated. Therefore, the fixed overhead cost incidence for the incumbents is much lower than it would be for the new entrant. Also, the new entrant typically would come with better technology, higher level of manufacturing operations, which would logically call for higher investments. Therefore, the threat of entry is kind of facing a barrier in terms of the cost adversity that a new entrant faces. That is a barrier to entry. The fourth barrier to entry is switching costs. That is, there are loyalties that are developed in the industry, in the marketplace, because of the association that exists between the customers and the buyers. Not only that, in respect of certain products, there would be advantages of having the same product line, the same company association continuing in terms of spare parts inventory, in terms of maintenance contracts, and in terms of ability to get idle time removed very fast. Therefore, there would be switching costs in making someone move from a known product and known service system to an unknown product and unknown service system. Therefore, there are time parameters and cost parameters of migrating users to another new product. This is the fourth barrier to entry. The fifth barrier to entry is the channel access. Typically, the dealerships, the distribution arrangements are always based on trust and relationship that are built over several years of association. And the dealers typically grow because of the support provided by the original equipment manufacturers. So these channels tend to be loyal to the end product manufacturers. To be able to get channel access is an uphill task. Many companies which entered the passenger car industry had to build their own channel access arrangements, and it cost them a lot of money. So the control and dominance which the existing industrial players have over channels is another formidable barrier to entry. And the other barrier to entry is the government policy, because government policies always dictate through various policies, whether it is of foreign direct investment percentage or through licensing or through regulation. They could limit or encourage new entry, exit and switching. Regulatory policies at times act as barriers to entry. These barriers to entry are not fixed by any means. They keep changing. They are liable to change. They are impacted by the company's strategies, and they operate differently at different points of time for different firms. And there are ways and means by which a new entrant can overcome these barriers for entry, primarily through two means. One, superior technology, and second, superior resource position. And when these are used in an optimal managerial manner, a new entrant can successfully overcome the barriers to entry. Therefore, the incumbents as well as the new entrants need to carefully assess the costs and benefits of new entry and incorporate those results in the formulation of strategy as well as the strategic plan. Entry barriers are boosted by a few factors. One, If a company has proprietary product technology, it would be able to erect much higher entry barrier. On the other hand, if the newcomer has got better proprietary technology, it would be able to overcome the entry barriers effortlessly. Secondly, if the existing player has favorable access to raw materials, it would be able to erect entry barriers. When you look at thermal power plants, they already have access to raw materials. Steel plants in India have access to raw materials, and they have relationships that have been going on for a long time. And more recently, through the auctioning processes, they have got more access through bids and purchase of these mines. So the existing companies have access to raw materials, and new company will find it difficult to get access, which is one of the reasons why whenever someone wants to enter a particular industry on a greenfield basis, they would prefer to make brownfield investments rather than totally greenfield, which is when ArcelorMittal decided to acquire an IBC steel company, that is a steel company which was under the insolvency proceedings, that is the SR Group steel plant, rather than try to establish a new plant, because the existing company comes with all these advantages of access to raw materials and co-location with component suppliers, favorable facility locations, etc. Government subsidies help. Because of the insolvency proceedings, several of the high value assets became available with significant reduction in the debt burden and with restructuring of the balance sheet. That has helped. In certain cases, governments provide direct subsidies, such as production-linked incentive schemes. The government of India under Prime Minister Narendra Modi has taken up the PLI schemes very vigorously. Several product groups have been provided these schemes so that there would be a thrust on Make in India. The latest to join this area is the semiconductor manufacturing situation. So government subsidies, government incentives play a big role in moderating the entry barriers. And finally, even if these entry barriers exist, when a newcomer comes in and starts learning how to operate in a new area, how to operate in a new country, the learning or experience curve starts kicking in, and the efficiencies will be attained by the newcomer as well as. At times, independent of the actual physical entry barriers, many times new entrants fear expected retaliation from the incumbents. That itself is an entry barrier. The existing players at times try to create an aura of invincibility. They make announcements about their capacity expansion so that newcomers are deterred from entering the industry. A company's leadership style also influences how this qualitative barrier can be overcome. So this is about entry barriers. So about industry rivalry. How is industry rivalry influenced? The strategies adopted by individual firms has got a great play on how industry rivalry takes shape. Companies indulge in excessive price competition to be able to gain market share. Companies try to invest very heavily in advertising, at times head-to-head competitive advertising. Companies try to overflow with product introductions. They try to saturate the marketplace. Wherever you turn, you find the product of the new entries by the existing incumbents. Increased discounts and promotions is another fire sale kind of strategy adopted by companies to gain market share in lumps. Lengthened service and warranty claims and terms. Overpaying for talent as a retention strategy. These are all strategic factors which determine the industry rivalry. Every now and then we see this happening. When we say excessive price competition, when you see advertising going on for festival sales, when you see the e-commerce giants saying that they are offering the best ever deals, these are all indicative of heavy marketing expenditure to gain market share. But prudential parameters require that industry rivalry strategy and the efforts to gain market share must not be at the expense of the profitability, because once profitability is dented, it will be difficult for the company to regain. So prudent managements take a strategic approach. They want to gain market share, all right, but they want to sustain their business and sustain their profitability for the future, because every business has to grow in three horizons. The first is the core horizon in which you are operating, and that has to be growing, and that has to be profitable, and must be providing resources to support the other two horizons of emerging businesses and the futuristic businesses. While external investors could support you for futuristic businesses, the emerging businesses must always be funded by the existing businesses, because emerging businesses have got the responsibility to take on from the existing businesses. Therefore, this kind of rotation of resources within the industrial system is essential for an industry to organize itself on healthy lines. What are the structural influences for industry rivalry? Independent of the strategies adopted by individual companies, if an industry has got numerous or equally balanced competitors, there would be high level of industry rivalry. If the industry growth slows down because the economic growth has slowed down, there would be negative impact on the industrial rivalry. Suppose the real estate activity in a country reduces, or the infrastructure building in the country reduces, then the demand for steel products would reduce. Therefore, the industry rivalry becomes heightened, because the lower cake is sought to be taken by larger rounds of capacity that are available. This is another aspect of industry rivalry. The third one is the high fixed or storage costs. That is, to be able to manage your operations, you need to have high warehouse capability. You need to invest in sophisticated distribution parameters. All that would cost money. That is one reason for industry rivalry. If all the products are looking similar, that is, there is no differentiation, then it is very easy for the buyers to keep switching from one product to the other product. Therefore, industry rivalry will be that much higher, and that would be reflected in terms of the advertising costs, in terms of the market related differentiation cost. If on the other hand there is a high level of customer loyalty, and it is impossible for a newcomer to easily lure the customer from the existing brand to the new brand, high switching costs have to be incurred, and that obviously leads to higher industry rivalry, because the incumbent will also try to retaliate against that move. If an industry is of such nature that capacity is not at shorter increase in blocks, but also entails huge requirements for capacity expansion, then there would be higher industry rivalry, because for every capacity increase you got to invest high levels of capital. That itself constitutes a factor of enhancing industry rivalry. If an industry has got diverse local and global competitors with high strategic stakes, and in the industry itself has got high exit barriers related to reputation of moving out, or bankers not wanting you to move out, or the leaders themselves wanting to see how the future plays out, then the industry rivalry would be very high. Now, this rivalry would be there. The intensity would increase depending upon the maturity level of the industry, whether the players are of live and let live kind of situation, or the players are little more aggressive and knee-jerk in their responses to the rivalry. If new joint ventures, mergers or acquisitions take place, then again there would be structural influence or industry rivalry. And if there are possibilities of strategic shifts, either from outside the industry into the industry, or from the industry to the outside, there would be industry rivalry. So when technology companies enter the electric vehicle and autonomous car field, it is a case of strategic shift from the technology space to the automobile space. Obviously, that will provide greater rivalry to the existing car industry. Similarly, when renewable energy makers enter the thermal power engineering sector, then there will be an exit pressure on the thermal power producers and greater industry rivalry as they jostle for space. So these are all the conditions and constraints that work towards industry rivalry in any industry. Wise leaders especially understand how a fine strategic balance can be kept between free market rivalry on one hand and the deep erosion of industry value that could occur if industry rivalry is completely unbridled and completely uncontrolled. Then exit barriers. Exit barriers are those barriers which prevent a company to exit an industry. A company would like to move out of an industry when it is no longer viable to continue the operations. It would like to exit an industry when its resources are limited and it sees much better opportunities in another industry. But if a company is not able to do that, then we can say that that industry has got high exit barriers. Exit barriers are obviously very different from entry barriers. They are existing mainly for different reasons for different companies. Typically, in the Indian situation, government policies never encouraged closure of firms. There is this requirement for supporting employment, and the Oriental mindset and the Indian mindset do not encourage hire and fire policies. We would like to preserve employment. We can imagine that in the global meltdown situation, when the developed world fired many employees and industries were completely restructured, India did not resort to any such downsizing of the industries and the firms. Therefore, there is a mindset in the Indian situation of supporting employment as much as possible. Second, there could be high costs of exit versus costs of continuance. That is, when you exit, you expect some kind of reasonable return for the assets that you have. But if they are being sold at a very marginal cost, or when you exit and there are reputational costs associated with that, loss of esteem happens when you abandon an industry, then you can say that there are high costs of exit vis-a-vis the costs of continuance. You may exit, but what is the alternative I have? Many promoter-led companies would like to continue in the existing industry as much as possible if there are no other alternatives for the family siblings or family lineage to run in the new areas. Therefore, these are the barriers which act as exit barriers for different reasons for different companies. Many times perceptions dictate the strategies to exit. When you have exit barriers on one hand and when you have entry barriers on the other hand, there is a nice analytical framework that would develop. You may exit an industry, but you should be very clear what are the entry barriers you are going to encounter when you are entering a particular industry. You may decide that you have built a good pharmaceutical business and it is time for opting out of the industry by selling off this generics industry to a multinational company. Yes, you will get a lot of money. But you should also be very clear, the new industry where you would like to enter may not offer the same level of comfort in terms of entry. If the company wants to exit a generic pharmaceutical business, most probably it would exit with non-compete reasons. That is, you cannot compete with the buyer of the business, in which case that business is ruled out. Then you need to enter into a new business, and that new business may have its own entry barriers. So the exit barriers you have on one hand may be counteracted by the entry barriers you have for fruitful deployment of your money. These therefore have to be analyzed together whenever a strategic decision is made by a company. Now let us look at a matrix of entry and exit barriers. Let's think of an industry where the entry barriers exist to enter the industry. Similarly, exit barriers also exist for moving out of the industry. So we can look at a low entry barrier, high entry barrier situation. Similarly, a low exit barrier and high exit barrier situation. Suppose the entry barriers are low. Similarly, the exit barriers are low. It is an industry where there would be low stable returns. It is an average middling kind of industry where there could be continuous flux because people can easily come in and people can also easily leave that industry. Suppose you have an industry where the exit barriers are very high. That is, once you come into the industry and operate for some time, it is very difficult for you to move out of that industry. But the entry barriers are very low, in which case the industry will attain the state of high rivalry very soon. That industry will have low risky returns. It is the worst case situation for any industry. Easy to enter, difficult to leave. Let's look at a situation where the exit barriers are low, but the entry barriers are high, which means that if certain incumbents are already there in the industry and they have established their entry barriers, it is very difficult for someone else to come into that industry. And the option to stay or leave is for the incumbents. So difficult to enter, easy to leave. It is in a way the best case for any industry or a firm, and this situation offers high and stable returns. On the other hand, there could be industries where the entry barriers are very high, the exit barriers are also very high. In sunrise technologies could be areas of such nature. Suppose somebody wants to invest significant amount in the semiconductor industry in India, which is going to be a new greenfield attempt, very important for India, an area of strategic importance for India's Atmanirbhar program. The entry barriers would be very high because you need to have proprietary technology, you need to have appropriate joint venture arrangements. You may set up your indigenous infrastructure, but suddenly a multinational company may come and then dominate the whole situation. And when the multinational company comes, it leverages its prior relationships with other vendors, with other end product manufacturers, and the new indigenous manufacturer could be in trouble. So the high entry barriers also are accompanied by high risk returns, because once you are in with the 20,000, 30,000 crores kind of investment, it's very difficult to leave that industry immediately. So you got to wait, you got to fight, you got to invest, and you have to see for the end game. So this entry exit barrier matrix is very important for understanding which industries make sense in terms of profitability, in terms of fluidity of movement, and these joint levels constitute an important part of industry analysis. And each combination, as I have outlined, reflects a different risk-reward relationship for the firms. All this is again influenced by technology, which is the reason why we are constantly trying to link strategy and technology in this course. Technology is an important driver that influences the relative ease and the relative difficulty of entry and exit. Now let's look at pressure from substitute products. Firms keep developing successive generations of products. This is a natural course. Without new products substituting for the previous ones, there would not be progress at all. However, substitutes at times redefine the entire contour of the existing industry in terms of product attractiveness and customer migration. Once upon a time, sugar was the only product that was available to sweeten any beverage or to develop any sweet product. Then came, along with health consciousness, sugar substitutes. But in these sugar substitute categories, there were variants. Aspartame was the first one. Next came sucralose, which was highly refined sugar. Then plant-based sugar came, stevia. Now we have other sugar substitute which have come into popularity: honey, jaggery, corn syrup, etc. Now the sugar industry, which was having 100% of the market for itself, faces a situation where several other products have taken the market from the basic sugar industry, and some of them have taken on the basis of health and nutrition parameters as well. So in which case, how do you manage this pressure from substitute products? Should you also go into the substitute product arena, or should you fight the substitute product by improving the existing product? These are all strategic considerations that one could have. Typically, again, those who offer substitutes are not necessarily in the same business as the original product. Honey is offered by several FMCG companies, but they are not into sugar manufacturing, sugar refining per se. They may sell sugar-based products, but they are not into the original sugar product per se. Similarly, manufacturers of jaggery and sugar are different. So, the substitute products and the original products tend to fight with each other rather than supplement each other or collaborate with each other. So, when you have substitute products, the nature of exit barriers gets different. Either the existing incumbent resigns itself to a declining demand situation and finds out ways and means of enhancing profitability despite the declining situation, or sees how the exit barriers can be overcome to move out of the industry situation. In this way also we have exit barriers and entry barriers, offer an analytical framework to understand how the pressure from substitute products can be coped with. But substitute products create pressure not merely from a product to product substitution. They create pressure by fulfilling the needs in different ways. So substitute products are of three types. One, they fulfill the needs differently. When you look at OTT movie streaming or the e-commerce, the needs that have always been there of watching movies or getting products are getting fulfilled in a different manner. If the needs are combined, as it happened with cell phones and all-in-one printers, then it is a different way of substitution of a product. And if the needs are split, as in the case of apparel and writing instruments, that is, pen is for certain purposes, ballpoint pen is for certain other purposes. Similarly, apparel, depending upon the season, depending upon the fashion statements, depending upon the gender diversity, the apparel can be of any types. Ethnicity could be one way the apparel is differentiated. So substitute products fulfill demands in different manners, and the pressure that arises from the substitute products therefore would also be different. The price performance equation on one hand and the user experience on the other hand, these are the two sides of the balance that influence how substitute products make the grade in an industry which is filled with the existing products. The force of substitute products come from this need fulfillment as well as the user experience that arises from the need fulfillment. Then let's look at the bargaining power of buyers. Buyers are extremely powerful. Mahatma Gandhi said that every business exists to satisfy the customer. Customer is the king. Long before the marketing tests came up with the customer centricity approach, Mahatma Gandhi was a visionary as far as this paradigm was concerned, that customer is the king. We exist for the customer, he said. A buyer group is powerful if the following circumstances hold true. If the buyer is the dominant purchaser of the output of the supplier. For an FMCG company, if the buyer keeps on buying the product on a regular basis for the family, then the buyer group is powerful. If the products that are purchased are a big percentage of the total purchase by the buyer, then also the buyer group is powerful. If the products that are on offer are standard and lack differentiation, therefore the buyer may choose to buy another product, then the buyer group becomes very powerful. The buyer has few switching costs. That is, if there is a connector for a cell phone with the electric system, if the USB is standardized, if the plug mechanism is standardized, then one can switch from one type of connector to another type of connector. Then there are no switching costs. So if the buyer has few switching costs, then also the buyer group is powerful. The buyer requires low costs, not because the buyer enjoys getting low costs, but the profitability of the buyer itself is low, in which case the bargaining power of buyer is also high. Buyers have the ability to integrate backwards. That is, if the supplier is not playing ball, then the buyer may say that I would myself produce or encourage another company to produce with my investment, in which case the buyer group enhances its power. If the product that is offered by the industry is relevant or less relevant to the buyer group, then also the buyer group has got high power. And if the buyer is one which has dominated industry for long and therefore knows thoroughly the industry, then the buyer is likely to have all the information at its fingertips. Then also the buyer group becomes very powerful. When these circumstances happen, the buyer group or the customers as a group become very powerful, and they can use this bargaining power to demand better prices, better services, better functionalities. They can play one competitor against the other, and that could lead to the expense of industry profitability. So this is a kind of situation where we see competitors in buyers, whereas actually buyers are the ones who are providing the necessity drive for a company to exist. If buyers are not there, then there is no need for any company or its products. So buyers are essential. But at the same time, we are saying that buyers are a competitive force. It is a way of looking at the paradigm. This doesn't mean that the firm has to be antagonistic towards the buyer group. The buyer has to be respectful. The firm which supplies to the buyer has to be respectful of the buyer group, but it also needs to appreciate how the relationship between the buyer group and itself can be a positive collaborative relationship rather than highly competitive and overwhelming relationship. When the firm as a supplier has no leeway to improve on any of these factors which are listed here, these 8 factors, then the bargaining power of buyers will be very high. On the other hand, a buyer may be able to leverage only 1 or 2 factors, in which case the firm which is supplying to the buyer group will be on a better position. How do you alter the buyer power? Obviously, by overcoming the factors that have been mentioned earlier, you can alter the buyer power. But on the other hand, we can look at a collaborative relationship so that both the supplier and the buyer benefits. So these are the 5 ways in which you can do. 1, you select your buyers in such a way that suppliers are also benefited. We can collaborate mutually between buyers and suppliers. There could be understanding to optimize costs to enhance deliveries. We can build quality into the supplier products so that the supplier benefits in the overall. We can network globally for the least cost solutions and also tell the suppliers that yes, there are least cost solutions available, you better match them and in the process benefit yourself as well as myself. We can have long-term supply relationships so that nobody is looking at today's foreign exchange rate or today's raw material supply rate. There would be a kind of stability in pricing and costing decisions. We had one example of active pharmaceutical ingredients which are being produced with fermentation-based products. By substituting fermentation-based products, raw materials, with chemical-based raw materials, we could achieve better API stability. So the buyer power was based on change of technology so that the hold which fermentation-based suppliers from Europe had on the company was reduced. So we could move from one type of supply source to another type of supply source, from one location of supply to another location of supply. But the buyer power is also affected by certain factors which are at times beyond the control of either the company or the buyers. There could be low material supplies. There could be geographic concentration. You want to get into electric vehicles business, but the cobalt is concentrated in Africa. Rare earths are concentrated in China. So there is a geographic concentration. There are geopolitical uncertainties. And non-ferrous metals and ores are not easy to extract and refine. These are the kinds of things which alter the buyer power because of the supply infrastructure that gets changed. So as long as suppliers are contented to play second fiddle to the original equipment manufacturers, then the buyer power will continue to be high. On the other hand, when suppliers, that is the component makers, enhance their proprietary technology capabilities, they would be able to have their relationship with the original equipment manufacturers on an even keel. The fragmentation of the industry, whether of the suppliers or of the end product manufacturers, has a key role in determining how the buyer power operates. Just as there would be buyer power, there would be bargaining power of suppliers as well. As I said, when there are supply shortages or capacity shortfalls, there would be by default an increase in the bargaining power of suppliers. That is not real, it is temporary, and one should not mistake it for an enduring bargaining power of suppliers. When you have few companies in the supplier industry and they are also more concentrated than the buyer industry, there will be high bargaining power of suppliers. When the end product manufacturer is influenced by the substitute products, but the supplier group itself is not impacted by substitute products, then the bargaining power of suppliers would be very high. When the industry is not an important constituent for the supplier group, that is the semiconductor industry again, they are supplying to so many other industries that automobile industry is not necessarily an important customer where 100% of the demand has to be met. They could be met to the extent of 80% as the experience proved. So it is an important customer, but not so important as keeping billions of smart devices go off the shelves. So that is the relativism that works. The supplier's product is important for the buyer's business. That is, without that product, you cannot make the vehicle or the product. That is, without fuel injection equipment, for example, you cannot make an engine. And if without an engine, you cannot make a truck or bus. Then the supplier has got huge bargaining power. That's why few companies such as Bosch or Nippon Denso, they become very powerful in the overall scheme of supply of fuel injection equipment for automobile companies. If the supplier group's products are differentiated or high switching costs, then again the suppliers would have a lot of power. When the gaskets were being moved from non-asbestos variety to asbestos variety, those who could innovate asbestos products out of the market and bring in the non-asbestos products into the market, such suppliers were successful. Similarly, when the supplier group has the ability to forward integrate to tier 1 supplies or even to the end product manufacturer, then the supplier group would have high power. But rarely that happens. Typically, the suppliers tend to be keeping their distinctive lines of operation relative to the end product manufacturer, because they have some advantages in keeping the supplier base intact and be global providers of components, rather than try to become end product manufacturers and limit their marketing only to the host nation or domestic nation. When the suppliers have no capability to improve upon any of these factors, then the bargaining power of buyers will be very high. On the other hand, if the supplier is able to improve upon all of these factors, the bargaining power of suppliers is very high. And typically, again, only one or two factors may be effective in each of these cases. How do you alter supplier? Same principles as altering the buyer power. Good supplier selection to favor buyers, collaboration between buyer and supplier to optimize costs, building quality into the buyer products. Therefore, the buyers will be motivated to buy only from the designated suppliers. Network globally for least cost solutions or best price solutions. Establishing long-term buying relationships. These are the ways in which supplier power can be altered and usually enhanced. So, the strategic view of altering supplier power is through better integration, better global sourcing, auctioning and bidding process, and collaboration. And to be able to have a sustainable lever on supplier power, one has to take the lead in product development. If the end product manufacturer innovates on the component level developments, the bargaining power of the buyer or the original equipment manufacturer would be high. On the other hand, if the supplier innovates in terms of product development of the new components, then the supplier would have higher power. Therefore, lead in product development, lead in technologies, supplier financing. If the suppliers are dependent on the buyers for financing, then the buyer power will be high. On the other hand, if suppliers are self-sufficient and they are able to get their own financing, their capability will be much higher, and strategic sourcing policies adopted would also influence the supply power. Typically, buyers like to have stability and reasonable cost of suppliers. Buyers also tend to be competitive amongst themselves. That is, buyers also have their market share targets, their revenue targets. They would therefore like to have preferential supplier arrangement. Therefore, suppliers constitute a very important aspect of strategic management. Supplier relationship is no longer just procurement. Suppliers have a strategic role to play in the evolution of strategy of a company. Having considered all that, we should also look at government as a force in industry competition. Once upon a time, there was control. Then liberalization came in 1992. From liberalization, we are coming into a situation where regulation had come in. That is, governments understood that when you have open sky policies, at times the customers lose their voice. Therefore, every new arena which was liberalized also had a regulatory authority. For stock markets and capital markets, we have Securities and Exchange Board of India. For pharmaceuticals, we have Drugs Control General of India. For insurance, IRDA. For telecom regulatory authority. For bad loans, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. And for drug standards, CDSCO. So every industry will have one regulator or the other. FSSAI for food. We have regulatory authorities which help. But today, the focus has moved from regulation also to incentivization. The kind of sweeping telecom industry changes that we have seen in 2021 are reflective of the recognition that regulation must also be accompanied by incentivization for development of the industry, particularly when the industry happens to be the core industry and when the industry requires huge amounts of capital investment to bring in modern technologies. It is important that the industry earns fair returns on investments, which means that regulation has to be accompanied by incentivization, which also means that where there are natural resources to be provided to industries, there should be open, fair, and viable means of allocation of those resources. This is one way by which government acts as a force in industry competition. Governments, through their trade policies, licenses, tariffs, taxes, regulations, as well as various policies of change, such as renewable energy, electric vehicles, privatization, and others, create new forces in industries. So when you look at structural analysis the way I have outlined, we will lead ourselves into competitive strategy. When we understand industry evolution and we understand the structure of the industry in terms of the number of players, the 5 competitive forces, the wheel of strategy, the parameters by which strategy can be developed, then we are at the threshold of developing a strategy. And to be able to develop a strategy, we need to also understand the firm's capabilities. What are my capabilities as a firm, so that I can benefit from the structural analysis of the industry that I have carried out. And the final point is development of competitive strategy. So you analyze your industry through structural analysis, you make a candid analysis of your capabilities as a firm, and together you develop the competitive strategy. It is a dynamic iterative process because the environment continuously changes, the industry is in a state of continuous evolution, markets continually change, and it is within our own capability to change a firm's competencies over time. Therefore, the development of competitive strategy is not a one-time affair. It is not even an annual affair. It has to be a continuous iterative process that happens all through the year. There are 3 types of approaches for competitive strategy. We can take offensive way of doing competitive strategy or a defensive way of doing competitive strategy. That is, we try to meet each of the 5 competitive forces head to head and try to overcome them. Or you say that discretion is the better part of valor in handling certain competitive forces, and therefore I will calibrate my response to various competitive forces. So first of all, you should position the company. That is, you should understand the firm's capability with reference to the industry level competitive forces. Second, you should try to influence the balance. That is, you should make those changes. You should make those competitive moves which will improve the firm's relative position. And thirdly, instead of trying to get engulfed in meeting the current competitive forces, focus on the future competitive forces, focus on the megatrends that could come, and therefore circumvent whatever is happening and move to a new future, so that the existing people who are caught in the existing froth of competitive forces are left behind and you lay a new path. Every firm should position itself advantageously vis-a-vis the competition in the chosen segments. You can position yourself, you can continuously change, you can exploit, but in competitive strategy, change is the one which keeps making the appropriate improvement in the strategy, particularly as the environment changes, as competition ups the game from time to time. There are 3 aspects of competitive strategy, because competitive strategy is not like an operational strategy. That is, you produce more and your costs are lower, therefore you are more competitive. Strategy doesn't work that way. It is not merely efficiency, that is trying to be more capable in terms of manufacturing. My time to market is lower, my resource raising capability is higher, my interest rates are lower. You cannot do it only on a functional efficiency manner, the total competitive strategy. These are all important building blocks of a competitive strategy, but having efficient functional strategies you cannot automatically say that the overall competitive strategy will be efficient or superior. You can, on the other hand, look at an effective competitive strategy. That is, I'm not in the broad spectrum competition. I would choose a market niche or a product niche where I can coexist happily, and I will attain a superior position without evoking extreme competition. But the ideal way is to have efficiency with effectiveness. That is, you be efficient functionally, but you are also strategically effective by choosing the right play given your competencies and environmental opportunities. So the dilemmas you have is, should I win over all the others in the industry? I should win in an absolute manner, or should I look for a win-win where everybody has a better pie of a better cake? So the important aspect of sustainable competitive advantage is that it should not self-destruct the industry. Our intention of competition is not to cartelize, certainly. Cartelization is the worst form of industry development, is the worst form of customer service. It doesn't act to the interest of the customers. There must be competition, there must be healthy competition based on technology, product features, service features. But sustainable competitive advantage for the industry and the constituent firms comes when there is no self-destruction of the industry by mindless acts of the incumbents. So to be able to do that, to be able to analyze an industry, to be able to introspect and develop the firm's profile, we need to link industry definition and structural analysis. We are saying industry evolution, we are saying structural analysis of the industry, but this begs the question as to what is the industry. Definition of an industry is very important to understand competitive forces and the overall dimension of competition and returns. It also tells you where the firm must compete. It is a matter of formulating competitive strategy. If you think of your industry as providing transport equipment, it is one definition of the industry. If you view yourself as providing mobility to users, it is a completely different industry. Once upon a time, there used to be food delivery companies, there used to be courier delivery companies, there used to be laundry delivery companies, and so on. But today, companies are defining themselves as delivery business companies, not as food delivery. Zomato wants to deliver everything else. Swiggy wants to deliver everything else. Dunzo has started this process of connecting anybody to anybody. They have become hyper-local couriers boys. Now, when this happens, the industry, without the knowledge of both the users and the firms, became transformed from supply of a product to delivery of a product. Emphasis on product at that point of time, now emphasis on delivery. So the way the industry evolves and the way you see the industry is a matter of formulating competitive strategy, and it also defines how we look at our business and how we want to compete. In this process, this structural analysis of the industry helps us understand the structural factors which are involved, the level of competition. If you see yourself as a food delivery company, your level of competition is at one level. But on the other hand, if you want to see yourself as a delivery company for every product on earth, then your managerial bandwidth is stretched, your digital backbone is stretched, your ability to have collaborative relationships with the main stakeholders is stretched, and probably you're not adding any value in the rest of the new businesses. Therefore, there are issues related to that. So structural analysis of the industry helps you in getting a good competitive strategy that can effectively deliver the business. So looking at all of these things, industry definition and structural analysis are the foundational conceptual and analytical frameworks for competitive strategy. So with this, we come to the end of lecture 3, and we will meet again in lecture 4 to take this discussion forward. Thank you.